This is Politics Unscripted. The segment of the show that's about to start now is the talking point. And this week, Reverend Allan Boesak delivered a sermon at the special service marking Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu's 90th birthday. Now, once a high-profile pastor turned politician, Boesak has been keeping a fairly low profile in the past few years. He was unfortunately sent to jail for misappropriation of funds. This was back in 1999, but he was pardoned in 2001. He joins us now to talk about Tutu's legacy and the role of the church in politics. Reverend Boesak, thank you so much for making the time to speak to us, and it was good to see you this past week delivering that sermon on the occasion of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu's 90th birthday. I want to start off this discussion by looking back at your role as someone who was part of the clergy at the time that the country was fighting the apartheid regime. And I want to start with whether you think that your role has been properly recognized in the country, given what you did back in the 80s and the 90s when you were up and down the length and breadth of this country trying to make sure that the apartheid regime is isolated by the international community.
Well, good afternoon, Connie, and good afternoon to all your viewers. And thank you for this conversation. I do not think about my role in terms of whether it is being recognized or not. The question is also by whom is it recognized? The people that might be in power and have been in power might have felt that there are all sorts of reasons why my role is not recognized. But two things. Number one, I care more about whether what I have done is appreciated and recognized by the ordinary people for whom we have done that. One does not enter a struggle in order to be recognized or be given praises. One enters a struggle because of one's love for justice, because of one's love for freedom, because of one's commitment to fight for freedom, because there is a struggle going on and one cannot, if one loves our people, stand on the sidelines. And my faith has compelled me from the very beginning to join this struggle, to do whatever I was called to do and whatever that was necessary to do. And so that's why we do it. I joined to see our people free. I joined to see our people enjoy freedom and dignity and justice. And those are the reasons one fights. And whether those who are in a position to recognize you or not does not matter.
Yeah.
That I'm being loved by my people today in a way that always humbles and surprises me, that's enough for me.
Perhaps the reason I want to start off with this segment about you and whether or not you have been properly recognized, it partly stems from a recent interview, or should I say recent comments that were made by our Justice Minister, Ronald Lamola, who was quoted as describing you as a gifted thinker who radicalized the church and who, these are his words now, despite his stumbling, has not been properly appreciated by the country. How would you want the country to remember you when that time comes?
Well, I mean, I would simply like to be remembered as somebody who tried his best, who obeyed the call of God for doing justice. I would like to be remembered as someone who, when called upon, did play his role, did not shirk his responsibilities, and someone who did not end his life in looking back in bitterness for what has been done to him by those who had the power to do so. And that, to me, is the core of what I would my life to be remembered for.
Yeah. Ryland Fisher, he's a seasoned journalist who needs no introduction to you, once referred to you as the king, or should I say, the unofficial king of the struggle. That's what he says about you. And he says, had it not been for the bad choices along the way, Boesak would have enjoyed international recognition and acclaim. Do you agree with his observations?
Well, no, I don't agree with his observations at all. Everybody stumbles in our own way. But I know what you're referring to, and it surprises me that after all these years, that is what you still choose to harp upon, because everybody now begins to understand that what has been done to me was a political setup, that I was singled out because I did not agree with the way in which the country's rulers were taking us. And I suffered for that resistance in that way. And for people who want to think about that, just think about this. We're talking about Archbishop Desmond Tutu today. In the 1990s, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, with the TRC, explained why he did not think that it would be helpful to try and take all those apartheid criminals who should have been all being sent to prison, to court, because, he says, in the 1990s, the courts were still overruled and captured by the judges that come from the apartheid time, and it would be against every single interest and instinct of them to punish those people who fought on their behalf and who did all those things to keep their privileges intact. Now, that was the 1990s. That was the same time that these charges were laid against me, that I was taken to court, that I was sent to prison. How in the world could one believe Desmond Tutu when he said that's the reason why we would not find any justice in the court still controlled by the apartheid people? And when it comes to me, you talk about as if what happened to me is actually justified. That's only one reason. There are others, but I will stop there for now.
Yeah. Let me put it to you this way. The scourge of corruption in our country, Reverend Boesak, is such that it is impacting, and I think more so now than any other time, it's impacting directly on the material lives of the people of this country. And I wanted to start off this discussion with your lessons that you may have learnt through your difficult period versus what some of the people that we see today who are seen as struggle heroes, whether you talk about Tony Yengeni, who was sent to prison for his misdeeds, you talk about former President Jacob Zuma, who is going through allegations of corruption. You talk about, in more recent times, the former health minister, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, who has had to leave government unceremoniously. I simply wanted to find out from you, what words of wisdom would you have for people like that?
I have no words of wisdom for any of those people. They have to deal with their own situation. But let me tell you once again, because I'm not sure where, my brother, you are going with this conversation. No, hang on, wait, that I respond to you.
Yes, sir. Continue.
All of those things that I had been charged with were supposedly for money that I had stolen from the poor. And nothing of that was found in any of those charges. All of the money that I was accused of having stolen for myself. Go and look at the report of Advocate Gumbi that she drew up for President Mbeki at the time. was money that came into the country after the banning of the organizations of the United Democratic Front, the banning and the detention of many of the leaders and the activists. I used that money to support them, their families, bail monies, and that's where it went. And there was no other ever evidence that the money was used for anything else. Not a single cent was found in any account that belonged to me. So I'm not sure what it is that you are trying to do when you ask me to talk about the life of Desmond Tutu, the role of the churches in the struggle. And then these conversations go about what I must say to Dr. Mkhize. Dr. Mkhize must deal with his issues. Mr. Ngeni must deal with it. Mr. Nyengeni must deal with his issues. Everybody else, Mr. Zuma, must deal with the issues. I refuse to be put in that category. I was sent to jail as a political punishment for a political stand that I was taking clearly against the grain of those who were in power, both from the newly elected African National Congress and from the old National Party that they went into bed with and joined to set up a program to further the suffering of our people, and that is what I was against, and that is what I was punished for. I got out of there, and if it was not for the Lord, I would be down today, I would be dead today, something would have happened to me. But look where God has placed me after all these years. And that's why I began by saying to you, I do not need the recognition of anybody of those who think they have the power in government or in the media to recognize me. The love of my people and the vindication of God is enough for me.
Yeah. The reason I perhaps wanted to talk or start about issues of corruption is because you spoke very rousingly when you delivered that sermon during the occasion of the birthday of Archbishop Tutu. And I don't want to put words in your mouth. In fact, I want to play a soundbite where you speak specifically about corruption during the very sermon that you delivered. I want us to have a listen for just a moment.
Africa as the most unequal society in the world today. I see corruption everywhere from top to bottom. I see hunger and poverty and violence stalking our people in the streets of our townships. I see gender-based violence has become a pandemic. We are some of the worst and most unsafe countries for women and girl children in the world. I see bigotry against LGBTQI people that is protected by the courts and baptized by the church. I see our people bewildered. Too many of our young people are lost, not knowing where they are coming from and where they were going because of what we are leaving them behind. We are like the people in the book of Isaiah. We grope like the blind along a wall. We stumble at noon as in the twilight. We wait for justice, but there is none.
And that is why I wanted to start this way, Reverend Boesak, that I would like for you to give me your impressions of the state of our country right now, before we talk about the legacy of the Arch. Take us through what your thoughts are about where we are in modern-day South Africa.
Well, Polly, you heard me. I mentioned all those things that are the scourge of our country and our people at this moment in history. No one can deny the state of corruption, the cover-ups, the way in which certain people are fingered and pointed at, but other people perhaps sacrificed. The failure of our leadership. There is no leadership. There is no sign of the politics of integrity and decency, the politics of courage that we fought for. There is the fact that the South Africa is today the most unequal society in the world is not just because the gap between the rich and the poor today is wider than it was during the days of apartheid, but that the gap between the rich black new elite and our poor impoverished masses, that gap is wider than ever before in the last 30 years. These are simply facts that nobody can run away from. Gender-based violence is a scourge. It is indeed a pandemic. LGBTQI people are tolerated because of our constitution, but the violence done to them through discrimination and through attacks every single day. And how many of those who do these things ever get into court? And we have cases that are hanging in the courts for years because of violence was not against a so-called normal person, but against a gay or a lesbian person or an intersex person. And so for me, all these things are a sign that, and I say this at every opportunity I get, this is not the country that we fought for. This is not the country that Desmond Tutu fought for. This is not the country that our people sacrificed for. And I think one of the things that the church must do is the church must be very clear in our testimony and in our analysis. We must not hide these facts from our people. They know where they stand. What they want to know is there somebody who will get up and speak on their behalf? Is there somebody who will give voice to those fears that they have? And is there somebody who will stand with them when they say enough is enough? We've got to make sure that the things that our ancestors, our elders fought for so many years, that these things, that those struggles have not been in vain. And that is what I was trying to say on Thursday, and that is what I try to say every time I get the opportunity to speak. Yeah, and you are someone that many people refer to as speaking the uncomfortable truths, and I hope that the start of our conversation was perhaps some reminder of who you were back in those days. When we continue, we're now going to discuss the legacy of Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu. You're watching Politics Unscripted, the segment of the show, The Talking Point, and we are talking to Reverend Allan Boesak, who recently delivered a sermon at the occasion of the birthday of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Reverend Boesak, I want to start off with a reminder to the viewers, just some of what you said was what Archbishop Desmond Tutu helped spark when he led the South African Council of Churches. Let's just have a listen for a moment.
And your leadership of the South African Council of Churches was a wake-up call to the church, as it was an alarm bell ringing for the apartheid regime. And after the vicious repressions of the 1960s, after Sharpeville massacre, they thought they had silenced the church. But God had other plans, and you came and you woke up the church. You shook the church up. Wake up, you said. See the suffering of our people. Wake up, you said to the church. See the oppression, see the hatred, see the racism. Wake up. See the tears in the eyes of our mothers and in the eyes of our fathers. See the bewilderment of our people. Get up, you said to the church. Smell the tear gas. See the dogs, hear the guns, feel the lash of the sjambok. See the overcrowded prisons with those detained without trial. Wake up, you said. Watch the children marching. Wake up, hear the children singing. Watch the children struggling for freedom. Don't let this happen while you stand on the sidelines. Wake up, you told the church. See the blood of our children on the streets of the nation. Reverend Boesak, my simple question to you, what was it
about Archbishop Desmond Tutu that helped turn the tide against the apartheid regime?
Well, when Archbishop Tutu became the General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches in 1978, he was, number one, the first black person to take over that position. And the South African churches, the South African Council of Churches, was made up mostly of the so-called English-speaking churches, in which the majority of the membership was black, but almost all the leadership was still white. So the black church, when it spoke, was speaking in a white voice, reflecting white solidarity and white interest. Desmond Tutu, coming in as a black person from South Africa in that position for the first time, could become the authentic voice of the church in South Africa. That's number one. Number two, he became the secretary of the South African Council of Churches 2 years after Soweto Revolution broke out. In 1979, he called for the annual conference, and he asked me to bring the keynote address. And we talked about the black church and the future and the role of the church in South Africa at that time. And what I said there, I absolutely meant. His leadership galvanized black leadership in the church. It helped give voice to the masses in the church. And people, young people, who were asking since 1976, where is the church? And who've been asking that question for a long time. Steve Biko had said that the black church was preaching in a way, presenting the Bible and taking our people to a poisoned well every Sunday. Because we could not talk to them about their freedom and about their struggle and about their liberation and what they should be doing. And what the South African Council of Churches did under Desmond Tutu's leadership was to change all of that. And so when we started doing that, the church became a factor in the struggle, the church became part of the struggle, and the church was able even to give leadership in the struggle from that point on, and right through the 1980s into the early 1990s. It was a very, very historic moment. It was a turning point, and it's because of Desmond Tutu's love for justice, and it was Desmond Tutu's commitment to justice and commitment to freedom and his love for our people that brought all those things together. And that was the shift that we needed, that was necessary at that particular point in our history.
The march that he led on the 13th of September 1989, it was billed as probably the most significant that brought the apartheid regime closer to its demise. What was significant about that march?
Well, let me put it this way, Colin. That march was significant. And it was significant for a number of reasons, but the most important reason why that was significant was that march was called for in September of 1989. When Bishop Tutu and I planned that march, sitting in the Archbishop home in Constantia, we were thinking about how shall we do this? Shall we, remember de Klerk had just become the president of the country. And one of the debates point was, shall we ask for permission, which was still intact, all those laws. Shall we ask for permission or shall we not ask for permission? And we decided not to ask for permission. And we said, the time has come for us to challenge Mr. de Klerk in a way that he had not been challenged before by staging this march, and let's see whether he would call in his army and the police, as they always did. That's number one. Number two, that march was not the most significant march. It was the march that gave culmination to marches that began way back in 1976, were suppressed, came back in 1979, and ever since then, through the 1980s, every single UDF march was a march through the 1980s where the church was prominently present, challengingly present, encouraging the people in ways that nothing else could, giving body to our faith. And in those days, remember, ministers were not only detained without trial, ministers were banned, ministers were murdered, they were assassinated, along with our activists. So by the time we got to 1989, you already had more than a decade of tension, decade of challenge building up, and the young people always present, the young people always present, the young people always taking the lead, the young people saying to the church, where are you? And when we came, they embraced our leadership and they helped us and they encouraged us. Now, by the time we got to 1989, the reason they called it the Peace March was not just because we called for peace. The reason why we call it the Peace March was that we say from here on in, our whole purpose was to create peace for the South Africa that was to come. And the peace must begin by the clerk and his government and his police behaving themselves, restraining themselves, give the people and acknowledge the people's right to walk in their streets and to call for the end of a system that was not only evil and a crime against humanity, but that the churches had begun to call in 1982 already a heresy and a blasphemy and a sin. And so that's significant march. And it brought together all sorts of people. I think it was perhaps the largest march that we have had, although Chris Hani and I had a march in Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape where we had more than 30,000 people, even then, when Chris Hani was alive.
And you mentioned the figure 30,000 because that's the figure that was bandied about as to just how big this march was.
I think there was more, though. Yeah. Because when we launched the United Democratic Front, there were thousands of people who came from all over the country. And the newspapers could bring themselves so far as to say there were 15,000 people. Now, I know that there were, I can count. I was there that day. There were more than 15,000 people. I mean, there were almost 1,000 policemen that day, all around. And I think, I mean, the numbers in a sense don't matter because we know how many people there were. But the numbers do matter because the numbers reflected people coming together at a time when calling for a march was risking arrest. At a time when going to a march was risking being shot at, being bitten by dogs, being terrorized by helicopters, shamboked, thrown in jail, tortured, and killed. That's what happened at every single march right across the country, whether it is in Cape Town or in Johannesburg and Port Elizabeth or Uitenhage or in the smallest little dorpie in the platteland. Every time there were casualties, and those are the sacrifices that built up the platform on which the 1989 Peace March found itself in September of that year.
Something else about that march struck me, Reverend, at a personal level, and that is, I'll explain in a moment why I say at a personal level, and that is that water cannons apparently spewed purple dye, which basically stained the protesters' clothes. And this apparently caught the imagination of international media across the world. Now, this made me remember a significant event because back in '89 I was a small boy. But it made me remember the water cannons and the kind of water they spewed in Marikana. That brings us into our recent past, the Marikana massacre. And that was a significant moment for the democratic state because this was said to have been the first massacre under a democratic state. And it brings us back to where we are in South Africa, the state of governance under the ANC. Where are we?
Well, that is a most important point that you are making right there, Collie. Before I go to Marikana, because that's tragic and that's so serious, I remember when they spurpled that purple thing on the people. I mean, our people are wonderful. The next thing that they made up was not the people shall govern, but the purple shall govern. Marching down the streets, holding their purple T-shirts and their shirts and whatever it is that got sprayed with that purple thing, and turning that ploy of the government into something for us to joke about and laugh about, and humor takes us always one step forward. That's number one. Number two, the Marikana thing, of course, is a serious thing. I have written a book in which I have said that the Marikana massacre is like the Sharpeville massacre, a turning point for South Africa. The Sharpeville massacre was a turning point for the apartheid government, because we then saw that they would not hesitate to train their guns and their live ammunition on peaceful protesters, only to show this is what white power can do. No matter how peaceful you try to be, this is what white power can do, and we will wipe you out if you challenge us. Now, that was, of course, repeated almost 100 times after 1976. And that was a farewell to our innocence in ways that we have not understood before. Not only did they, like in 1960, say we will shoot on unarmed protesters, those were adults, people. Those were grown-ups. In 1976, they shot our children. And so they were telling us, even if your children are in our way, we will exterminate them because they threaten white power. Now, that was a turning point for the country, for politics, for the churches. In 2012, with Marikana, to see our government and our officials, the man who's now president, sent an email basically to say, you have my blessing, treat them as criminals. Those were his words. And the police let loose and shot, I mean, how many people? 35 people died in the first, 30 minutes?
34.
34. I mean, that was such a shock. And just as that time of Sharpeville became a moment of reckoning for the apartheid regime, Marikana has already become a moment of reckoning for the African National Congress. Those bullets that killed our people, our brothers and sisters, miners, were not bullets shot by white hands, given instructions by a mouth from a white government. That was our liberation movement, doing to us what the white government had done to us before. That is a traumatic moment that I think most of our people are still coming to terms with, or trying to come to terms with. But let me say to you today, that is a moment that the African National Congress will not ever be able to overcome unless something dramatic happens with their leadership and with the way in which they deal with these issues.
Reverend, let's pause there for a moment and take a break. When we return, we conclude the discussion with Reverend Boesak. You're watching Politics Unscripted. This is the talking point, and we are talking to Reverend Allan Boesak. He needs no introduction. He is well known, and we're about to conclude our discussion, Reverend, and bringing things closer to where we are in South Africa today. And we've just spoken about the Marikana massacre, and I want to perhaps, before I get to my next point, call up another soundbite of yours where you speak about Desmond Tutu and about how some would have wanted him dead some time ago, because he was such an uncomfortable person to deal with, I suppose, for the apartheid regime. But I want to steal his words and bring them to modern-day South Africa. But before we do that, let's have a listen to Reverend Boesak talking about Desmond Tutu and why some would have wanted him dead by now.
Some people, and I know some, had their way. You would have been dead already. From Pretoria to London to Washington, D.C., to Paris to Moscow, you would have not been here. Their wish would have been just for Desmond Tutu to be gone and to shut up or be shut up. But here you are. They had those plans, but God had other plans.
God had other plans. Reverend Boesak, the Archbishop Thabo Makgoba was quoted recently as saying that, and I quote, Tutu was so fed up with today's democratic government, and end quote. I'm not sure which era he was referring to or he would have been quoted speaking about, but the bottom line is that the ANC has been in power for the past 27 years now. In your view, do you think that that is indeed still the view of the Arch as he turned 90 this past week, that he's still fed up with the ANC-run government?
Well, let me say this, Colin. Over the years, the Archbishop and I had many discussions. And when I came back from the United States and became a professor at Victoria University, we also talked, because I was now much more intimately in touch with young people, to hear what they are saying and to hear their views. And we shared those conversations. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was fed up and angry at the apartheid regime, but he was as angry at the ANC government when it became clear that the ANC government, whilst it had the power entrusted to it by our people, had no plans to make the lives of our people better. They were not committed to justice. I said yesterday they had justice in their purview, but they never had justice in their purpose. They had self-enrichment and self-entitlement in their purpose. Desmond Tutu is not stupid. He saw all those things. Desmond Tutu is not a man who will give you a compliment while he meant something else. He's too honest. He's too clear in his own thinking. When he told me, you don't belong in politics, you belong in the pulpit, he meant it, and he never changed his mind. And he never stopped bothering me about it until I left politics. And so he didn't say, oh, Allan, you'll do well, because there's nothing like that. He told me, this is a mistake, and you should not do this. So he is as clear with himself as he is with his friends and with everybody else. So
do you think he was right? Do you think
about
he was
me?
Right? Yes.
Yeah, he was. Collie, I never belonged in politics. I mean, I may have thought so. And my first foray into politics was because Madiba was so persistent. And who can say no to Madiba? No. My wife was against it. Desmond Tutu said, don't do it. You don't belong. And later on he said to me, you don't belong with these people. I mean, it was very clear that he was, as he saw what was happening. And remember, Desmond Tutu, like me, we never fought for the ANC to get into power. We fought for the freedom of our people. That's a different question. And so if you give the freedom of our people into the hands of the African National Congress, but you know, the ANC that I had in my mind, that Desmond had in his mind and in his heart from history, that ANC is not the ANC that came back from exile. And that is the trauma that we are still dealing with, our old activists. I still can't get over it, how you do it. So now today, he will be very, very clear. And when we talked the other day, we talked about what should be happening. And it was clear. He was worried about the leadership. He was worried about the way we do things. He was worried about all those things that I mentioned. All those are issues that Desmond Tutu keeps on putting on the table, or kept on putting on the table while he was still able, and that we must take up and continue to fight for now that his voice is quieter than it used to be. And what I said to him, in terms of what I hope for the future, now that I deal with so many young people from all walks of life, my hope is in those young people, because they come to me and they say to me, what is it that you guys did in those days that made you so strong? And we talk about that, and we share experiences, and we share strategies. And they are so determined. I think that if Desmond Tutu could spend, like I do, a whole evening or a half a day with young people and just hear them speak and see their love for their country and see their revolutionary commitment to bring about the changes that they now know we did not fulfill completely, that he would be very, very happy. That would give him the kind of comfort that it gives me. But he knows that our country has gone astray. We have lost our way in a tragic way, and that it's now up to us. We still have the strength, still have the energy, still have the courage that we get from wherever we get our courage from. I get mine from God. Other people get theirs from something else. But to use that energy to try and do two things: speak truth to our people in power, and then secondly, speak truth to our people in struggle.
Reverend Allan Boesak, that's where we are going to leave this discussion. Thank you so much for the history that you've shared with us. A struggle activist in his own right, Reverend Allan Boesak. Thanks indeed for your time.